Hello and welcome to One and All. So in today's class, I'm continuing the indifference curve analysis. So the other day, I've explained to you about the indifference, what is the meaning of indifference curve, and I also explained to you the indifference schedule. Okay. So if the same schedule, if we are representing graphically, then that is the indifference curve diagram. Okay. So the x-axis, good x, and y-axis, good y. If you remember, we took the example of Barbie dolls and comic books, isn't it? So the same, whatever the table, I'm representing in the form of a diagram. So initially, for 15 comic books, the combination one was 15 comic books and one Barbie doll. Then later decreases to 11 comic books for additional one more Barbie doll, and later 8 comic books for 3, and then afterwards 6 comic books for one more additional of Barbie doll, and finally 5 for. So this is what we have represented in the table, isn't it? So now so these points are all the each different combinations. So this is combination 1, combination 2, combination 3, combination 4, and combination 5. So when we join all these points, we are getting a curve. So let me join all these points. We are getting the curve. And this is what is the indifference curve. Okay. So now all these points, combination 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these combinations are going to give the same level of satisfaction. So put it in the words. So IC is the indifference curve, and all the points, so all the points 1 to 5 represent different combinations of two goods, X and Y, and all these combinations all these combination lying on the indifference curve IC give same level of satisfaction to the consumer. Okay, so that's why the other name for indifference curve is, it is also called as ISO utility curve or equal utility curve, because everything is giving all these points, they are giving the same level of satisfaction to the consumer. So these called as the ISO utility or the equal utility curve. Okay, and there is one thing you might be noticing here. So we can see that, so this gap keeps on decreasing, isn't it? So initially 4 units of Y is sacrificed for additional 1 unit of commodity X. Then later again, this is only 3 units are sacrificed now for additional 1 unit of commodity Y. So like that, this keeps on 2:1, 1:1. So we can see that this is the marginal rate of substitution. So this is delta Y, delta X. So MRS xy is equal to delta y by delta x. Okay, so this MRS this is how they are representing the MRS of xy keeps on decreasing as the consumer. Okay, now this is what is the indifference curve. So 3:1, 2:1, and 1:2. So this is how the MRS xy keeps on decreasing. Okay, 1:1. I hope it's clear now. So this decreasing MRS xy, this is the basis for indifference curve analysis. So this is supposed to be the shape of indifference curve. Okay, so now there are the main thing to note here is all these points on the indifference curve give the same level of satisfaction to the consumer. So the consumer is indifferent. The consumer can choose combination 3. The consumer can choose combination 2. The consumer can choose combination 5. So any combination can be selected by the consumer. So that's why because everything is giving the same level of satisfaction, the consumer is indifferent to any one of these combinations. So this is what the indifference curve analysis represents. Okay, so now let's check out. Of course, the consumer has to pick up out of these combinations. The consumer finally has to pick up one of the combination. If you just go and provide the guideline to the consumer saying that you can pick up any of the combinations, which because everything is giving you the same level of satisfaction, you can pick up any one of the combination. Then that means what we are not providing the proper guideline to the consumer, isn't it? So which out of these combinations, which combination the consumer will select? So that depends upon the prices of commodity X and Y as well as the budget of the money income of the consumer. So based on that, the consumer can pick up. It is not about change. The consumer can pick up only one of these combinations out of all these 5. Okay, so that's how the consumer will attain that equilibrium position. But before I explain to you about that consumer, which combination the consumer will pick up, let us check out what are all the properties of indifference curve. So the properties in the sense that why the indifference curve is shaped like this, why the curve is like this. This is convex to the shape is called as the convex to the origin. Why that indifference curve is convex to the origin? So that's what is explained through the various properties of indifference curve. Okay, so moving on to the properties of indifference curve. So the first property of indifference curve is an indifference curve is negatively sloped towards down. So this is the first property. So this is the, just now we have seen, this is a negatively sloped. Okay. So what is the reason? Here we are representing good X and here we are representing the good Y. So if it is negatively sloped, what is happening? If the consumer has to increase the consumption of one commodity, the consumer, so the consumption of commodity X is increasing, the consumption of commodity Y is decreasing. So that's why it is negatively sloped. So the reason is because if the consumer has to increase the consumption of one good, he or she has to decrease the consumption of other good. Then only the consumer will remain in the same level of satisfaction. All the points on the indifference curve, all the combinations lying on the indifference curve give the consumer the same level of satisfaction. That is one of the most important thing. The satisfaction should not change. So only if one good has to be increased, the consumption of another good has to decrease. Decrease the consumption of another good. So that's why it is negatively sloped. See, suppose if the, for example, if you take, if the if it is if it is going upwards, and this is positively, this is sloping downwards, this is sloping downwards. Sloping downwards is negatively sloped. Sloping upwards is positive, this is positively sloped. So now if it is positively sloped, what is happening? Both are increasing. So this is against the principle of indifference curve. And so it cannot be horizontal straight line, it cannot be vertical straight line. These are all ruled out. If it is horizontal straight line, the consumer is increasing the consumption of only one commodity, either, I mean, only the commodity X. If it is vertical straight line, the consumer is increasing the consumption of only the Y commodity. So, but here our consumer wants the combination increase both, or wants the combination of both the commodity X and commodity Y. Okay, it is not that one commodity is kept constant and the consumer keeps on increasing the other commodity. It is not like that. Okay, so that's why these are all not the shapes of the indifference curve. It is only negatively sloped downwards. Okay, that is the first property of indifference curve. Then the second property of indifference curve is indifference curves are always convex to the origin. Okay, so this is convex. Whatever this diagram represents, this is convex to the origin. So this is convex. Suppose if I draw the concave, so it is, if the shape is like this, let us assume the shape is right now. What is happening? So this is the one combination. So like that. So these are all the points. So 1, 2, 3. So these are all the points. So if it is concave to the origin, what do you find here? So we are finding that this gap keeps on widening, isn't it? That means what? If it is concave, the marginal rate of substitution will increase. So this is again against the principle of indifference curve. Only if it is convex to the origin, the marginal rate of substitution will keep on decreasing. This is a normal human psychology. It's not only just the principle of indifference curve. If you are asked to sacrifice more and more units of a particular commodity, you will not be willing to sacrifice more of that particular commodity. So this is the normal human tendency. Okay, so that's why it cannot be concave to the origin. So, or in other words, the indifference curves are always convex to the origin because then only the marginal rate of substitution of one good for another good will be diminishing. Okay, so this is the main reason indifference curves are convex to the origin. Okay, then the third property of indifference curve is indifference curve can never intersect each other. So why it can never intersect? So again, let's take an example. So let us assume this is one curve, IC1. So we'll have another curve, IC2. Okay. So now we are having A, B, C. Three combinations are there on IC1, and again D, again B is there, and E. Okay. So three combinations are there on IC2. Okay. Now what is happening here? A, B, C, they are all on IC1, and D, B, and E, they are all lying on IC2. So here ABC on IC1 should give a same satisfaction, isn't it? And DBE on IC2, that also should give a same satisfaction to the consumer. But at this point, what we are finding, up to B, IC2 is lying on a lower plane than the IC1. So up to B, IC2 is giving lesser satisfaction than IC1. Beyond B, beyond point B, IC2 is giving greater satisfaction than IC1. This is observed, isn't it? So all the points should give the same level of satisfaction. So up to certain level, it is giving lesser satisfaction. Beyond a certain level, it is giving a higher satisfaction. This is something observed. So that's why indifference curve should never intersect each other. Okay. So because if the reason is because then only the satisfaction level will remain the same. So intersect each other, because then only the satisfaction levels will remain the same. Or in other words, if it intersects, it indicates two different levels of satisfaction which is observed. Okay. Then the fourth property is a higher indifference curve represents a higher level of satisfaction than a lower indifference curve. So this is, the fifth one. A higher indifference curve represents a higher level of satisfaction than a lower indifference curve. Okay. So this is, see, for example, let's draw a diagram. X, Y, as usual. Good X is represented on a x-axis and Y on the y-axis. So let us say first indifference curve IC1, and consumer can have another indifference curve IC2. Still the consumer can move on to another indifference curve IC3. So definitely you can see that the consumer can IC3 is going to give more amount of satisfaction to the consumer than IC2 and IC1, isn't it? So here IC1, IC2 and IC3. So IC3 is giving more satisfaction to the consumer than IC2. IC2 is giving more satisfaction to the consumer than IC1, because IC3 the consumer can purchase more amount of goods, isn't it? So here, this, if the consumer is lying on IC1, this is the amount of goods. If the consumer moves to IC2, then more of commodity X. If the consumer moves to IC3, more of even more of commodity X, isn't it? So as the consumer keeps on moving on the higher and higher level of indifference curves, the satisfaction will keep on increasing because more number of goods in the consumption basket. So definitely the consumer will prefer the higher indifference curve on the right hand side than the lower indifference curve which is lying on the left hand side. So let us assume this is at the when the consumer is having the income of 10,000 rupees, the consumer can purchase any one of the combinations lying on IC1. Okay. If the consumer income increases to, let us assume 20,000, automatically the consumer can afford to purchase more amount of goods. So the consumer can purchase any amount of goods lying on IC2. Still, if the consumer's income increases to another 10,000, so that means what? As the income of the consumer keeps on increasing, then the consumer can keep on purchasing more and more amount of goods. So the consumer can keep on shifting rightwards, moving on, going on a higher and higher levels of indifference score. So definitely IC3 is giving more satisfaction to the consumer than IC2 and IC1. So that's why the fourth the fourth property of indifference curve, a higher indifference curve represents the higher level of satisfaction than a lower indifference curve. So higher indifference curve is all the indifference curves on the right hand side. So that gives a more level of satisfaction. The reason is because with higher indifference curve, the consumer can purchase more units of either X or Y or both. So it's possible the consumer can purchase more of both X and Y, or can purchase either one of. So that's why higher level of indifference curve represents higher level of satisfaction. Okay. Then finally, an indifference curve should never touch any of the axis. I mean, it should not touch neither the x-axis nor it should touch the y-axis. Let's see. Suppose if the indifference curve, see this is the correct, it should be like this, it should not touch any of the axis. So let's say why it should never touch. Suppose if it touches either x-axis or y-axis. So let us take this one. If the indifference curve lies like this, or if the indifference curve is like this, okay, so then that means what, at least, or the indifference curve can be like this. So if it touches both x and y axis, so at this point x commodity is 0, at this point the y commodity is 0. So here y is 0, x the consumer can purchase, at this point x is equal to 0. So the consumer should have the combination of both x and y. If it touches either of the axis, that shows that one commodity is 0. That is against the principle of indifference curve. Normally the consumer wants the combination of both x and y. So that's why an indifference curve should never touch any of the axis. Because it implies the consumption of one good x or y is 0. but the consumer prefers the combination of both goods. That means what? It should not be one good, should not be zero. The consumer wants the combination of both goods, X and Y. Okay, so that's why it should never touch any of the axis. So these are all the properties of indifference curve. I just want to mention there is what is the shape of the indifference curve. Shape of indifference curve. So one situation, if two goods are perfect substitutes and two goods are perfect complementary. See, this is quite important for the students who are preparing for CPT. So what is the shape of the indifference curve for perfect substitutes and perfect complementaries? So for the perfect substitute, the shape of the indifference curve will be a straight line. Okay. So that means let us assume good X. Let us assume coffee, cups of coffee. Okay. X axis, Y axis, good Y. Let me assume cups of tea. So suppose if a consumer prefers coffee and tea, both are can totally perfect substitutes means what? Commodity X can be totally replaced by commodity Y. If you want to give up 1 unit of commodity X, then you will purchase 1 unit of commodity Y. See, in our example, what is happening? The for comic books and Bobby doll, they both are not perfect substitutes, isn't it? So if the suppose if comic books and Bobby doll, they both are perfect substitutes. If Dolly wants to have one Barbie doll, she will give up only one comic book. If Dolly wants to have two Barbie dolls, she will give up only two comic books. Like then, how many units of Barbie dolls she wants? That much amount of comic books she will sacrifice. But comic books and Barbie dolls, they are not perfect substitute. Like that, most of the commodities in the actual practice, they both are not perfect substitutes for this. But in case if there is a perfect, if any two commodities are perfect substitutes for a consumer, see for example, let us take the example, a consumer finds coffee and tea are equally preferred by a consumer. So 1 cup of coffee is equal to 1 cup of tea. So let us assume like that. Suppose if the consumer has either the 3 cups of tea and 1 cup of coffee. So if the consumer prefers unit of one more cup of coffee, sacrificing 1 cup of tea, and again 1 cup, another cup of coffee, sacrificing another cup. So now if you join, this will be a straight line. I mean, it's supposed to, if you draw in a scale and this thing, it will show like this. So this will be a straight line. So straight line, so this is the shape of the indifference curve if two commodities are perfect substitutes. So that means what? Equal amount of units of commodity X will be given up for equal amount of addition of commodity Y. So that's the meaning of perfect substitutes. And in the case of complementary goods, so then IC will be, it will be L shaped. So L shaped, so that is, so why it is L shaped? See for example, let us take the complementary goods means you require both the commodity to satisfy your one want. Okay, so the complementary goods are just opposite to substitutes. Okay, substitutes either this or that, either commodity X or commodity Y. But whereas complementary goods, commodity X and commodity Y. So without the another commodity, the commodity Y, commodity X is useless. Okay, that is a complementary goods. Okay, so let us take here, let us take the pair of shoes. So right leg pair of shoes, and here we are representing left pair of shoes. So if you are having two pairs of shoes, which is for left leg, then you need two pairs for right leg also, isn't it? So this is the thing. And what is happening? Suppose you have three pair of left shoes and only two, you can increase like that. This is no use. You're having three pair of left only for the left side, left leg, and without only two pairs of right leg, then this is no use for you, isn't it? This extra. In the same way, if you are having one more here, but left pair of shoes, you are having left leg only two pairs, but then right leg you are having three pairs. This is no use to you. Okay, so this is also no use. So now this is the combination. So that's why this with the perfect complementaries, this is L shaped. Okay, so this is the shape of the indifference curve for perfectly complementary commodities. Okay, so these are all the now we have seen the what are the properties of indifference curve, what is the indifference curve, etc. And in the next class we will check out, based on the indifference curve, how the consumer attains the equilibrium position. So everything is finally to provide the guideline how the consumer will attain the equilibrium position. Either it is a cardinal utility analysis or the ordinal utility analysis. The economists are trying to provide that guideline to the consumer. Okay, so in my next class I will explain to you how the consumer, with the help of cardinal utility analysis, that is the indifference curve technique, how the consumer is can get that equilibrium position. Okay, hope you find this video useful. So if you have any doubts or your suggestions, please mention in the comment box. And if you like this, if you find this video useful, please like, share, and subscribe. And until my next class, next video, take care. Bye bye.